everybody. All right, so we're going to get started on Module 5 lectures. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, so the first reading we have for this week is the Glass Escalator Revisited. And this is actually talking about where the author went through and looked at their original piece that they had written, much like we did with the 5 sexes, and then went back and was like, hey, how is this not pertinent, or what were the critiques of it, and how can I make this better or more accurately describing the phenomenon that I am talking about? So originally it showed that men holding only leadership and tokenism type positions in those higher and had higher pays for jobs predominantly formed by women. So they were talking about nursing, they were talking about teaching, they were talking about specifically things geared towards the social roles geared towards women in the workplace. All right, so what they went back and did and wanted to do was really look at how intersectionality might impact some of those avenues. So is it true that all men are experiencing these things in these ways, or do some men experience these things in very different ways? And so they talked about, they used 3 different kind of really case points for talking about intersectionality, and that was Black men in nursing, gay and lesbian teachers, and working class trans men. And so really what they found when they really looked at Black men in nursing specifically is this idea of holding those leadership roles weren't necessarily happening. That idea of that better pay wasn't always happening. And also that when they were looking at and gearing towards this, they were finding that white men typically were misplaced, or even men of Asian cultures were looked at really from a perspective of being misplaced as the doctor, whereas Black men were being misplaced as maybe an orderly or possibly even the janitorial staff. And so there was a very key distinction there happening for Black men in these nursing environments, where their race was impacting the ways in which their male privilege might have operated for other men within these things, and the reasons why that they are the phenomenon originally talked about in the original article that she wrote. So when she went back and looked at this, she was really noticing that race was really impacting how those things were being navigated. And so they also found similar things with gay and lesbian teachers. They were worried about stigmas surrounding misconstrued understandings of homosexuality as pedophilia, especially in gay men, and why they would want to be teachers of young kids and all of that, even if they were very good at it, even if they were in no way, shape, or form a harm. No one is inherently a harm due to their sexuality to children. Let's make that perfectly clear. Pedophilia is a crime, not a sexuality. So there is an inherent risk that they were experiencing with disclosures or with being openly who they were within their job. And so we were really seeing how these intersections are impacting especially these men in different ways than these we're talking about, but not just the men too, right? Because then they talked about lesbian teachers and they talked about really needing to feel like they are passing, needing to feel like they don't have more masculine traits, needing to feel like they are that typical feminine, hyper self-aware, hyper emotionally intuitive kind of idyllic teacher status, especially when working with young kids. And then they were talking about, again, working class trans men, and talking about how they experienced more authority. They were assumed to be more competent, and they were given greater rewards and recognition and economic opportunities compared to when they were women. However, or when they were identifying as women, which could have happened earlier in their life. But they also, in contrast, did not, but trans women were not experiencing these same benefits. And so it's very interesting to watch how this cis normative versus this trans identities were really interplaying in interesting ways. And so really those are the ways in which the author really wanted to go back and kind of take a look at how intersectionality plays a part in what it means to be working and what it means to be an individual working in these specific kind of female oriented fields. And again, that is not to say that nursing, teaching, or any other job is specific to a gender, or that any person should not have an interest in it based on their gender. These are things that society, in those learned behaviors that we have talked about in prior modules, really steer individuals towards based on their gender. So there's a very key distinction there, and I want to make sure we're making it so that you are not hearing anything in this lecture as, well, Annie said that Professor Bowen was talking about these things and saying that, men weren't really geared towards nursing. That is not what I am saying. I am saying really that these are things that society generally steers women more towards, because men that generally are interested in medicine generally get steered closer towards being a doctor. And those are things that we can talk about too. The last thing they kind of wanted to address when they redid this was really how work was changing. And they were specifically talking a lot about temp work and how the nature of work isn't you get a career, you find a job, you stay in that career until you retire, or for a very extended period of time, or until maybe the company shifts or the entire market shifts, or like the coal industry collapse, you'd have to find another career. But like there was a way in which the economy was made to function as connected to these one track kind of tract oriented job markets. And unfortunately, because of capitalism, that is no longer really economically feasible for companies. And well, it's not as profitable. And companies realized, capitalists entirely realized, and the boards of companies followed suit, that really if they could hire and fire quickly, and they could have a very expendable work base that had less benefits that they had to pay out, that had less comp time that they had to pay out, that didn't have overtime. All of these things would affect that bottom line for that company. And so that companies ended up changing how in which the ways in which work operated. So again, this included a lot of things like having a lot of jobs over the course of a lifetime. I mean, for instance, I went back to school in my 30s and ended up now teaching you guys, but my original occupation, I started as an early childhood educator, and I did that for almost a decade. After being an early childhood educator, I decided to get into the restaurant industry and managed and operated and bartended at multiple facilities before I decided to go back to school after I had kids. So it's interesting because, there are very distinct changes that have happened in work over the course of decades. And it's something that will probably continue to see change as capitalism figures out ways in which to make workers' work more profitable for them and less economically stable for those who are working. So again, they also want to, some of the other things they were talking about within work were this idea of this trap door or this revolving door again being that idea that there's a revolving door of individuals that would come and go or could come and go from in any industry or in any specific situation that would allow for workers to not necessarily have the same experiences as that escalator as they talked about. So like where they talked about men automatically kind of rode that escalator all the way up to the top, and those things being very different now because that's not necessarily how they might operate in today's economy. And so really just kind of figuring out how you want to look at these key terms. A couple of them come up in the extra reading that is there too. And so that's kind of all I have for this one. But pay attention to kind of how intersectionality really impacts work and how work is really changing in this day and age, and in what ways capitalism is driving those changes to really be the key points for this module. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get off here, and I'm going to go ahead and end this lecture, and I will get back to you again soon. All right, bye guys.